Welcome, listeners. In the aftermath of a world torn apart by the infected, Danielle and Mason have found refuge in a cold, lifeless bunker. But as their dwindling supplies and the passing days take their toll, the thought of escaping to a dangerous, silent world begins to feel like their only option. With the air thick with the weight of their isolation, they make the desperate decision to leave the bunker behind, stepping into a world where the silence is as threatening as the infected themselves. What waits for them beyond the safety of their walls could be far worse, or a chance at a life they thought they'd never have again. But in this new world, survival is no longer just about making it through the day. It's about facing the uncertain future of a world that has already begun to change. Will they find safety, or will they just become another forgotten story? A Still and Silent Apocalypse by NoSleep scribe. The hum of the ventilation system had become a constant companion in their underground home. The gray walls of the bunker absorbed sound, making the air feel heavy with the passage of time. There were no clocks or windows, just the furnace's occasional shift, keeping the cold at bay. Danielle Adams sat cross-legged on the floor, dim light casting long shadows across their cramped quarters. She stared at the dwindling stack of supplies, cans of beans, powdered milk, dried fruit, the last of their stockpile. Her fingers traced the label on a can of peaches, something they hadn't had in months. It seemed trivial now, but back then they'd savored each bite. Danielle, Mason's voice cut through the silence. He sat at the table, scanning a hand-drawn map of their surroundings. We're out of water. Danielle sighed. She didn't need him to say it. Every day the bunker felt more like a coffin. I'll go tomorrow, she said softly, her voice thick with exhaustion. She couldn't bring herself to meet his eyes. Mason leaned back, rubbing his eyes. We can't keep doing this, Danny. The last of the clean water's gone. The rationing won't last a month, and the nearest safe zone is miles away. We can't stay here. We're too exposed. They're still out there. The unspoken truth hung between them. Danielle didn't want to admit it, but the infected weren't the only threat anymore. The bunker felt like a trap, and Mason had become a different person in the months of isolation. He'd once been the steady one, the one with answers. Now uncertainty gnawed at him, and she could see it in his eyes. I know, she whispered, but I don't know what's out there. We don't even know if those zones are still active. We don't know if anyone's left alive. Mason's silence filled the space between them. Finally, he stood, his boots scraping on the concrete. He walked over, resting his hands on the table and leaning in, his voice softer now. We'll figure it out. Together. We always do. Danielle looked up. His eyes, tired but steady, met hers. But something else lingered there, a flicker of doubt, of fear. I'm scared, Mason, she admitted, her voice trembling. What if we don't make it? What if the world outside has changed so much there's nothing left for us? Mason's hand brushed her hair back, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know, but if we stay here, we're not living. We're just waiting for it to end. I can't do that anymore. Not with you, not with us. We deserve more. Danielle closed her eyes, squeezing her fists to keep from breaking. She wanted to scream, to find the reason to stay where it was safe. But she knew he was right. They couldn't stay here forever. The decision had been coming for weeks. Now it was a matter of what were they willing to risk for the hope of something more. Finally, Danielle stood and walked to the small window in the corner, her hand resting against the cool glass. The world beyond was dim, the sky hidden behind gray clouds, empty, silent. It felt erased. "We'll leave tomorrow," she said, the words heavy in her mouth. Mason's hand rested on her shoulder. "We'll go together." The next morning, they gathered the last of their supplies. It felt like packing for a journey that could end at any moment, but they had no choice. They had to move. The steel door creaked open with a groan, louder than it should have been in such an empty world. Danielle hesitated at the threshold, the cold air hitting her face. She pulled her collar tighter, but it wasn't the cold that made her skin crawl. It was the silence. Mason stepped out into the sunlight as though he could outrun the fear. His eyes squinted due to the now unfamiliar brightness. The only movement he noted was trash blowing in the wind. The chill in the air and the fresh scent was an invigorating change from the unchanging stale bunker. Even the sound of the wind blowing and the trash skittering along the road stimulated his overly deprived senses. Danielle hesitated behind him, staring at the concrete of the bunker's entrance, their only home for so long. Fear of leaving their place of safety warred with anticipation of what they might find along their journey. She took a deep breath and decided to let anticipation win. Mason looked back at her. "Ready?" Danielle nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yeah, let's go." With one last glance at the bunker, she stepped forward, the door shutting behind her with a heavy finality. The world outside felt wrong in a way Danielle couldn't pinpoint. The lack of people, the decaying ruins of homes and businesses. It wasn't just the emptiness. It was the way the wind whispered through the buildings, how distant sounds of scraping across pavement sent shocks of terror through her chest. They walked quickly, making their way toward the road. The outskirts of town offered a better chance of avoiding the infected, and the buildings here were fewer and farther between. "Do you think we're the only ones left?" Danielle asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mason didn't answer immediately. "I don't know, but I don't think so. There has to be others, maybe in the safe zones." They reached a crossroad. Mason checked the map, tracing a path to the nearest safe zone. A few days' walk. The thought of potentially infected areas made Danielle's stomach twist. "We'll make it together," Mason said, more to reassure himself than anything. Danielle nodded, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched, wondering what was lurking just beyond their sight. By late afternoon, they reached a stretch of road that was eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant sounds, just the oppressive silence again. "Mason," Danielle said, her voice tight with unease. "Do you hear that?" Mason paused, scanning the horizon. He heard it too, a faint, distorted sound, like footsteps dragging across gravel. "They're here," Mason said, his voice a low growl. Danielle's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" Mason's hand instinctively went to his Glock. "Behind us." Before they could react, 3 infected figures appeared from behind an overturned truck. their limbs jerky and erratic. Their eyes were vacant, bloodshot. They spread out like they were coordinating with each other. One charged towards Danielle, arms outstretched, fingers curling into claws. "Run!" Mason shouted, but it was too late. The infected were already upon them. Danielle sprinted down the road, adrenaline pushing her forward, but her body screamed for rest. She made it a few feet before one of the infected grabbed her arm, pulling her back with terrifying strength. Danielle screamed, kicking at its legs, trying to break free. The infected's grip was relentless. She reached for her knife. Then, crack! The sound of a shot splitting the air. Danielle spun around. Mason stood with his Glock raised, firing. Bang! The first infected dropped. Another shot. Bang! The second one fell. The third lunged, but bang! Mason's third shot landed perfectly. The road fell silent again, save for distant rustling. Danielle, panting and trembling, pulled herself free, stumbling towards Mason. "You okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I'm fine. Just, I didn't expect them to be like that. They attacked as a group, almost like coordinated." "They're learning," Mason muttered. Danielle didn't answer. She didn't need to. They'd made it out, but the outside world had already begun to change. Mason stood over the bodies of the infected, his Glock still clenched, eyes scanning for any movement. The world was eerily still, but he knew better than to think they were safe. One moment they had been walking through a once bustling town, the next fighting for their lives. Danielle stood a few feet away, trying to steady her breath, heart still hammering. Fear, which had been building since they left the bunker, spilled over. She couldn't stop it. "Danielle?" Mason's voice cut through the air, making her jump. "You okay?" She nodded, though it wasn't convincing. "Yeah, I just wasn't ready for that." Mason gave a tight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Neither was I." He holstered his gun and stepped closer. The world around them felt distorted, like the ground beneath them was shifting. The attack had reminded them how fragile their lives were outside the bunker. "Let's move," Mason said urgently. "We can't stay here too long." Danielle nodded, forcing her legs to move despite the numbness. They were still far from the nearest safe zone, and uncertainty about what awaited them pressed heavily. They moved in silence, walking along the overgrown highway. The road was cracked and chipped, covered in dirt and debris. Trees on either side stretched higher than they remembered, their branches heavy with vines and rotting leaves. The world felt emptier the further they walked. Abandoned homes, broken windows, rusted out cars, each one a reminder of the civilization they once knew. Danielle's stomach twisted with unease. The world was different now, ghostly, fading. "Do you think we'll make it?" she asked softly, tracing their route on the map. Mason's gaze remained fixed ahead, scanning for danger. "We have to. We don't have a choice." Danielle didn't respond. She wasn't sure she believed him. The infected weren't just mindless killers anymore. They were organized, adapting to their environment. They came upon another small town, its buildings sagging under years of neglect. The air was thick with decay, and the silence was oppressive. The only sound was the wind whispering through broken windows. "We should check that pharmacy," Mason suggested, pointing toward a building with its door ajar. "We need medical supplies." Danielle hesitated. "What if there's more of them inside?" "We can't keep walking without supplies," Mason said, his voice steady. "We'll go in fast, in and out." Danielle bit her lip, considering the risk. But Mason was right. They needed medicine. They couldn't afford to pass up the chance. They approached cautiously, Mason leading, his hand resting on his gun. Danielle followed close behind, eyes darting between shadows and broken glass underfoot. The door creaked as they entered, the dim light from the overcast sky filtering through cracked windows. The pharmacy was eerily quiet, its shelves still stocked with medicine. Danielle moved towards one aisle, her hands shaking as she grabbed a box of antibiotics. Mason's voice broke the silence. "Danielle, look out!" Before she could turn, something scraped across the floor behind her. She spun, her heart leaping into her throat. A single infected was rising from behind a shelf, crouched on all fours, blood dripping from its mouth. The infected growled, jerking forward with unnatural speed. Danielle barely had time to react before Mason fired. The infected dropped, twitching violently. Danielle froze, breath caught in her chest. Mason quickly moved to her side, checking their surroundings. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern flooding his voice. Danielle nodded, swallowing hard. I am just shaken." "We need to get out of here," Mason said. "Now." Without wasting time, they grabbed what they needed and rushed to the door. Mason kept his eyes peeled for more infected as they stepped into the street again. The weight of the world pressed down on them, but now they had supplies to keep going. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Danielle and Mason found shelter for the night in an old motel. The door was broken, the walls cracked, but it would have to do. They made a fire in the back corner using old newspapers and a broken chair to get the flames going. It wasn't much, but enough to ward off the chill for a few hours. Danielle sat on the bed looking at the map again, trying to figure out their next move. Progress had been made, but the zone they were aiming for was still miles away, and each step felt more dangerous. "We can make it," Mason said, sitting next to her. "We just have to keep moving." But doubt crept in. The road ahead was uncertain, and the longer they stayed out here, the more Danielle wondered if they were walking toward safety or toward their end. As the fire flickered in the corner, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world was closing in on them. The infected were evolving, the zones growing. The longer they waited, the more they realized the world outside might be more dangerous than ever, and there was no way to know whether the safe zone was truly salvation or another trap. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the motel room, casting flickering shadows on the cracked walls. The faint scent of charred paper mixed with the musty air, but for a brief moment, the tension of the day faded, replaced by a fragile calm. Danielle sat cross-legged on the bed, the map spread out before her, but her focus was elsewhere, absently tracing the edge of the paper, her mind wandering. The map had become a blur of lines, towns, and roads. It was just something to hold on to, a distraction. Mason sat quietly on the edge of the other bed, hands resting in his lap. His posture was rigid, despite the exhaustion that weighed on them both. When their eyes met, something softer lingered in his gaze. "We've made it this far," he said, his voice low. "We're still alive." Danielle looked up at him, a tired smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah, still alive." He stood and walked over to her, his boots soft on the cracked floor, then sat beside of her on the bed. The mattress creaked under his weight, and they sat in silence, the warmth of the fire mingling with the quiet between them. Mason reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, as if he needed the contact as much as she did. She gave him a small, reassuring squeeze. Despite the tension that still lingered, in this moment, their worries felt distant. He turned her hand over gently, his thumb brushing her palm, as if memorizing the feel of her skin. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder, the world outside suddenly fading. "I was thinking," Mason started, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "We've been through so much already. I don't know how we've managed it, but we have." Danielle lifted her head slightly, meeting his gaze. The firelight danced in his brown eyes, and she saw the exhaustion, the fear, but also the quiet strength that had kept them going. "We've always managed," she replied softly, warmth in her voice. "You and me, we always find a way." Mason's lips twitched into a faint smile. He kissed the back of her hand, the touch tender. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Danny. I don't know how I'd keep going." She smiled, her heart swelling with infection. "You'd find a way. You always do." Mason chuckled, though it was tired. "Maybe, but it wouldn't be the same without you. I don't know how I ended up with someone like you, but I'm damn glad I did." Her heart fluttered at his words, the softness of his voice melting some of the heaviness in her chest. She cupped his cheek gently and kissed him, a simple, soft kiss, a fleeting touch that was more about comfort than passion. For a few seconds, the chaos outside, the uncertainty, the infected, ceased to exist. It was just the two of them together, holding on to something real in a world slipping away. From the first moment we met, when I literally ran into you and landed on my ass, I knew you were the one. Looking up at you, haloed by the sun, your eyes full of concern and that little half smile, I felt my world change. Danielle sighed. When they pulled back, their foreheads rested together. Danielle felt his steady breath against her skin. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I love you too," Mason replied, his voice thick with emotion. They stayed like that for a long time, breathing each other in, feeling the weight of their shared history and the uncertain future ahead. Despite everything, despite the world outside, the fear and the loss, they still had this. They still had each other. Finally, Danielle sat up, drawing away enough to meet his gaze. "We're going to make it through this, together, no matter what." Mason's eyes softened, a quiet strength in his expression. "Yeah, together." The fire continued to crackle in the corner, the only sound in the room besides their steady breathing. The world outside was dark and uncertain, but in this small, dimly lit room, there was a flicker of light, a beacon that kept them anchored to each other. The morning sun filtered through the grimy motel window, casting long streaks of light on the floor. The fire had burned down to embers in the corner, its warmth lingering in the air, but it couldn't erase the weight of uncertainty. Danielle stood by the window, staring at the quiet street outside. The stillness unsettled her. The absence of life felt as threatening as the infected. No cars, no voices, just the wind whistling through the trees. Mason packed their things in the corner, his movements quick but controlled. Despite the exhaustion, he was focused, determined, but Danielle could see the tremor in his hands as he folded the map. He kept checking the door, as if expecting something to appear. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above the whisper. The question had been building for hours, and now, standing on the edge of leaving the relative safety of the motel, she had to voice it. Mason looked up, brow furrowed as he zipped a bag. "We have to. We're out of supplies. We need to find something. Anything. The nearest safe zone." "I know," Danielle interrupted softly. "But what if it's just another lie? What if it's worse than what we're leaving behind?" Mason crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady. "I don't know, but if we stay here, we'll die. We don't have enough food to last another month, and who knows how long it'll take to find a place like this again. If there's a chance of safety, we have to take it. At this point, I would give up everything else just to know you are safe and secure, with food and clean water and a place to call your own." She nodded, the weight of the decision settling into her bones. They couldn't turn back now. With their bags packed, they stepped into the cool morning air. The streets felt emptier now, the silence pressing down on them as they made their way to the road. The world outside seemed more uncertain than yesterday, and the fear that had once been distant now felt too close. They walked for hours, the steady rhythm of their steps the only sound. The landscape was bleak. Abandoned homes, broken windows, overturned cars. No infected yet, but the feeling of being watched lingered. "Think we're getting closer?" Danielle asked, her voice barely audible against the desolation. Mason glanced at the map, tracing their route. "I don't know. The map's old. It might not be accurate anymore." Danielle's doubt crept in. How much had the world changed? How much had stayed the same? She glanced at Mason, who wore a determined expression, though she could see the strain in his eyes. He wasn't saying it, but she knew he was starting to question if the safe zones were even still out there. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Danielle spotted something ahead. At first, she thought it was just another broken building, but as they approached, she saw shapes. The figures were scattered across the road, moving in slow, staggered patterns. There were 4 of them, dragging their feet with an eerie coordination. Danielle's breath caught. She recognized them instantly. The infected. But these weren't typical mindless wanderers. There was an odd rhythm to their movement, like they were being herded. "Stay low," Mason whispered, his hand tightening around his gun. "We don't know how many are out there." Danielle nodded, heart pounding, and crouched behind a half-destroyed car, hand on the knife at her belt. Mason took slow steps forward, eyes fixed on the infected. The figures moved away from them, heading into the shadow of a collapsed building as if they had a destination. "What are they doing?" Danielle muttered. "I don't know," Mason said tightly, "but we need to keep moving." Just as they were about to make their way around the car, one of the infected stopped, its head jerking up as if sensing something. The others halted and turned towards them. Danielle's heart skipped. The infected were looking right at them. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then, as quickly as they had stopped, the group turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the ruins. Mason stood, watching them carefully. That was strange. Danielle didn't answer, but the unease gnawing at her stomach had only grown. She didn't understand what the infected were doing, or why they were focused on something in the distance. It wasn't random anymore. It was purposeful. "We need to keep moving," Mason said, his tone firm. "The safe zone isn't too far. We'll make it. Just stay close." Danielle nodded, but the feeling of doubt didn't go away. She didn't know if they could trust the safe zones anymore, or even if they could trust their own instincts. The next few days blurred together in a haze of dusty roads and abandoned buildings. The closer they got to the settlement, the more palpable the tension became. Every rustling leaf, every shadow made Danielle's stomach twist. The infected weren't just a random force anymore. They were adapting in ways that made no sense. Still, they kept walking. Late in the afternoon, they saw it. A dilapidated sign creaking in the wind. The faded paint barely read, "Welcome to Stonehaven." Mason quickened his pace, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. This wasn't out of the woods, but a settlement meant people, supplies, maybe safety. They pressed on through crumbling buildings, the streets empty but not entirely abandoned. Clothes hung on lines. A bicycle leaned against a fence. It felt almost normal. They stopped and scanned the area. There were no walls, no guards. The buildings were weathered, the windows cracked, but it was the first real sign of civilization they had seen. "We're getting closer," Mason said, lowering his gun but keeping it within reach. "Let's check it out." Danielle hesitated, feeling a knot in her stomach. "Do you think it's safe?" "We won't know until we try," Mason replied, pulling her gently along. They moved cautiously into the town, the silence broken only by the wind and creaking wood. Passing an old convenience store, they saw shelves stocked with food. A schoolhouse stood across the street, the faint sound of something moving inside. "We're not alone," Danielle whispered. Mason nodded, tightening his grip on the Glock at his waist. "Stay close." As they ventured deeper, their hopes of reaching others were dashed. 3 infected moved into the street. They weren't moving aimlessly. They took up positions as if they were on guard. More emerged. Some stood frozen, staring into the distance, while others paced slowly, as if on patrol. "What are they doing?" Danielle muttered. "They're organized, coordinated. I don't know why, but they are acting with purpose," Mason said. Before Danielle could respond, a sudden flash of motion caught her eye. A figure darted from one building to another. More infected appeared, emerging from alleyways with low growls. "Get down!" Mason shouted, pulling her behind a van. The first attack came without warning. 5 infected burst from the shadows, charging toward them with unnerving speed. Danielle barely had time to react before Mason was already firing. The first dropped, a clean shot through the head, but the others kept coming. "Run!" Mason shouted. "Get to cover!" Danielle sprinted for a nearby building, but one of the infected lunged, grabbing her arm with a grip like iron. She screamed as it pulled her back, its teeth bared, saliva dripping. Mason swung around, his Glock raised, but the infected was too close. The shot went wide. "Mason!" Danielle cried, struggling to break free, her heart hammering. Mason didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time landing a perfect shot to the infected's head. It crumpled at her feet, its grip gone. Danielle gasped, stumbling back into Mason's arms. She was shaking, but he held her tight. "We need to move," Mason said, his voice urgent. "Now." They sprinted down the street, dodging into alleyways. The infected followed, the world closing in from all sides. When they reached the edge of town, Danielle stopped to catch her breath. The infected were still trailing them, but something felt different. They weren't charging anymore. "They're stopping," Danielle murmured, her eyes wide with confusion. Mason looked back, suspicion clouding his expression. "They're not just chasing us, they're waiting." He grabbed her arm and quickened their pace. "Stay close, let's get out of here." But the questions gnawed at them. What were the infected doing? Why did they stop? Were they evolving, learning to adapt? As they reached the outskirts, Danielle glanced back one last time. The infected were still standing in place, facing the horizon. Something about their stillness unsettled her, but there wasn't time to figure it out. Mason pulled her forward, pushing on toward the unknown. The sun hung low in the sky as Danielle and Mason walked, their legs aching and nerves on edge. The landscape had shifted. What was once a mix of scattered buildings now faded into overgrown woods and crumbling roads. They stopped to rest, sitting on the edge of a desolate road. The quiet that had surrounded them for days felt suffocating. No infected, no signs of life, just the rustling of leaves. "I thought we'd see more survivors by now," Danielle said, exhaustion thick in her voice. "If there are safe zones, shouldn't there be more people?" Mason's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "Not necessarily. People hide, especially now. The infected are smarter. Most probably stay in the zones like we plan to." Danielle shifted uneasily. What if the zones are a lie? What if we get there and it's worse than what we're leaving behind? Mason's jaw tightened. "We'll find out when we get there, but we won't know if we don't try." As they continued, shadows stretched into the trees, marking the end of another day on the road. They hadn't seen much except a few infected, which they had avoided easily. But when they rounded a bend, something made their hearts stop. Ahead, figures moved swiftly and with purpose at the edge of the tree line. At least 6 of them. They weren't the usual aimless wanderers. These were different. Danielle's breath caught. "Mason!" He pulled her behind a tree for cover. They crouched low, watching as the group drew closer. The people looked ragged but coordinated, armed with scavenged weapons. They spoke in low voices, scanning their surroundings. "We need to be careful," Mason whispered. "They might be hostile." Danielle's heart raced. What if they're just trying to survive like us? "They might be," Mason replied grimly, "but we can't risk it until we know more." As the group moved closer, one man, tall and weathered, stopped, scanning the area. His eyes seemed to linger on their hiding spot. "Hey," he called calmly, "I know you're out there. You can come out now." Danielle froze. She instinctively moved closer to Mason, who was already reaching for his gun. Before he could react, the man held up his hands. "We're not here to hurt anyone," he said, his voice flat but sincere. "We've been on the road for days just looking for others." Mason hesitated. Something about the man's voice was different, less aggressive than he expected. After a tense silence, Mason nodded. He stood slowly, gun still at his side but not raised. Danielle followed, standing as well. The man lowered his hands and stepped forward cautiously. "I'm Connor. This is Nancy, Ben, and the rest of our group. We're from a settlement nearby. Just wanted to make sure you're not infected." "We're not," Danielle said quickly, glancing at Mason for confirmation. Mason gave a slight nod. "And the settlement? It's safe?" Connor smiled, though his eyes remained wary. "Safe as any place can be. We've learned the hard way that sticking together is the best way to survive. We don't trust many, but we don't shoot first either." Mason didn't raise his gun and softened his stance. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" Connor shrugged, motioning behind him. "You're welcome to come see for yourselves, but you'll have to decide quickly. It's a long walk, and the infected don't keep to their own boundaries." Mason's expression remained guarded. "And what happens if we don't come?" Connor's expression grew more guarded, but his voice stayed even. "You're free to go wherever you want, but the world out here is dangerous. You'd be taking a risk." Danielle exchanged a glance with Mason. The road ahead loomed uncertain, but this was a chance they hadn't had in months. "We'll come with you," Danielle said, her voice steady. She turned to Mason, giving him a reassuring look. "We don't really have another option." Mason sighed and nodded. "Fine, but we're not trusting anyone until we know what's going on." Connor smiled again, his posture relaxing. "Fair enough. Come on, we'll show you the way." The group led them through the woods, down narrow paths they had likely walked many times. Danielle kept a close eye on the others, noting the tension between them. The group was quiet, but there was an underlying wariness in their movements. As the sun set, they reached the settlement, modestly built homes constructed from scrap wood and metal. Some had solar panels, but there was a hasty survivalist feel to it all. "This is it," Connor said, leading them into a small courtyard. A few people were repairing equipment or tending a small garden. Mason and Danielle exchanged a look, but followed Connor inside. The air smelled of fresh food, and there was a hum of activity. Children running around, adults working together. It wasn't perfect, but it was a community. Connor led them to a small meeting area where a few others were seated. "This is Margot," he said, introducing the woman sitting nearby. "She's the leader here." Margot stood, her eyes assessing Danielle and Mason carefully. "Welcome to Riverton. Let's see what you've got. If you want to stay, we'll need to make sure you're not a threat." The small settlement of Riverton felt worlds apart from the desolation they had walked through. Danielle had expected tension, distrust, but the people here were surprisingly welcoming. As they sat around a fire pit, Mason and Danielle took in the sights. Children running, men and women talking in hushed tones, the faint smell of stew wafting through the air. It was almost normal, but it wasn't normal. Nothing about the world could be called normal anymore. Connor and Margot had invited them to dinner, but it wasn't just hospitality. It was an offer, a chance to stop wandering, to have some semblance of security. But at what cost? Once dinner finished and the children were tucked away, the group gathered around the fire pit. Margot leaned forward, eyes never leaving Mason and Danielle. "We don't usually take in strangers this easily," she said, her voice calm but cautious. "But you two look like you're trying to make it through this world, just like us." Mason nodded. "We don't have much of a choice. We've been on the road for days, and we're not sure where else to go." Connor, sitting across from the fire, spoke up. "The government-run zones promise safety, but they keep you in a box. They control everything, what you do, where you go. Here, we make our own choices." Danielle shifted uneasily. "And the risks? What happens when the world notices Riverton?" Margot met her gaze. "We stay off the radar. The perimeter zones are great if you want certainty, but here we make our own rules. We have people who can fight, build, and we're self-sufficient. The risk, it's the same as in those zones." Mason leaned in. "You think the government zones are a bigger risk?" Margot glanced at Connor, who gave her a nod. "In some ways, those zones promise safety, but it's built on control. They'll make you part of their experiment. You won't have a say in what happens next. You have more physical safety, but in many ways you were in a prison." Danielle frowned. "But they have walls, perimeters. They've kept the infected out. They have systems. What happens here when we run out of food?" Margot smiled faintly. "We don't have walls. We've learned to use the land around us, grow what we can, trade with nearby settlements. It's harder, but it's survival. The government zones, you follow their rules, their systems. If the infected get too close, they'll throw you in quarantine. But here, we make decisions." Danielle paused, absorbing the weight of Margot's words. "So you're saying we could survive here without the..." She motioned towards the broken map of the safe zones. "Without the fences, without the rules?" "It's a different kind of survival," Margot said, "but it's survival all the same. No walls, no one to tell us what we can and can't do, and we fight back when we need to. We lose people sometimes, but not often, and we are better armed every day." Connor spoke up, his voice low. "I'm not saying the government zones are all bad. If you want safety, they offer it, but at a price. They control what you eat, where you go. You'll never really be free." Mason thought for a long moment. "We've heard rumors. The government zones treat people like cattle. Safety, but with too much control. Sounds like a prison without fences." Danielle shook her head. "How do we know they won't use us as test subjects? I've heard stories, disappearances, cleanup operations when things go wrong." Margot nodded, understanding the concern. "It's a different kind of life there. Follow their rules and you'll be fed, housed, but you won't have a choice. If you're not valuable, they'll discard you. Here, at least, we don't bow to anyone. If something goes wrong, we fix it ourselves." The conversation fell into silence as the fire crackled. Danielle and Mason exchanged a glance. The idea of the safe zones, controlled and structured, was appealing, but there was a suffocating certainty to it. It was hard to ignore the whispers of people being pushed into submission for the sake of safety. But Riverton, they didn't have walls, no guaranteed safety, just a fight for every scrap. The question was simple. What was more important, safety or freedom? "We're not saying you should stay here," Margot said after a pause. "But if you want to, we can show you what we've built. You can see how we live." Danielle and Mason exchanged a look. "Thanks," Danielle said softly. "We'll think about it." Mason, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "If we leave here, we won't be coming back. But maybe we can make it work here. We'll need time to decide." The decision was made. Danielle and Mason spent the night in Riverton's guest quarters. Bare walls, a few blankets, but it was a roof over their heads, more than they'd had in a while. The bed was a welcome relief from the hard ground, but the weight of their choice lingered. It wasn't just comfort. It was the understanding that they had chosen this place. The next morning, the sun filtered through the grimy window. Outside, the streets of Riverton were alive with quiet activity. People tending gardens, repairing structures, talking in low voices. It was a place of purpose, but Danielle felt an undercurrent of tension. Everyone here seemed to walk a fine line between survival and collapse. Mason stood at the window watching the street. "It's strange," he murmured. "Everything's moving, but it feels like we're waiting for something." Danielle nodded. "Like it's too quiet, too controlled. What happens if it breaks?" "I don't know," Mason replied. "But for now, it's the best choice we've got. Moving on towards the government-controlled zones means traveling alone through areas controlled by the infected. Here we have safety in numbers and a functioning society based on personal freedom. Although I admit I would prefer some fences." They hadn't discussed it much after the fire pit conversation, but there was an unspoken understanding. Riverton wasn't perfect, but it was something. They couldn't keep wandering forever. Riverton had its own rhythm, a mix of rules and self-sufficiency. The settlers didn't have walls, but they had a tight-knit network that governed daily life. It wasn't as controlling as the government zones, but it was still a system. Everyone had a role to play, and it gave Danielle a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in months. Margot, Connor, and the others showed them how to use the water filtration system, grow food, and find hidden supplies around the settlement. It was more than survival. It was a chance to be part of something. "So how did you become the leader here?" Danielle asked Margot as they worked in the garden. Margot smiled. "I was one of a group of 5 that established this place. I actually worked my way up to manager of one of the big box stores in the old world. So logistics and managing people was what I had to offer. We all contribute where we are strongest." Still, something felt off. There was an undertone of urgency that no one spoke about. People moved quickly, working with purpose, but it wasn't lost on Danielle and Mason that Riverton's fragile peace could easily crumble. "You can never really relax here," Danielle said one night, sitting by the fire. "Everyone's looking for the next supply. It's like they know things aren't as solid as they pretend." Mason sighed, staring into the fire. I thought it would feel more certain. Danielle leaned back against the rough stone wall, pulling her knees to her chest. I thought it'd feel like home. Mason was silent for a moment. Maybe it will eventually, but yeah, not yet. They fell into silence, wondering if this was home or just another stop in their endless fight for survival. The next few days were filled with introductions and responsibilities. Danielle worked in the garden with Margot and others, learning how to grow vegetables, herbs, and fruits. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had in the bunker. Mason worked with Connor and the men on repairs, patching up roofs, fixing windows, checking the perimeter. They didn't have walls, but it was clear they understood security. "We do everything ourselves," Margot had said one evening. "The government zones may be safe, but they don't offer freedom. You follow their rules or you're out. I am not willing to give up freedom for safety. That's just a different kind of death." Danielle wanted to believe it, but as she worked alongside Margot, she saw the tension in her eyes. The settlers were tight-knit, but not as welcoming as they'd first appeared. There was something they weren't telling them, something behind those guarded smiles. "How often do the infected attack? How long has it been since you lost someone?" Danielle asked nervously. Margot didn't meet her eyes. "We've never had a large attack. We get groups of 2 or 3 every couple of weeks. We had a couple disappear about a month ago. They could have left, could have been attacked. We couldn't find anything definite." Danielle liked Margot, liked the whole group, but she wasn't sure that the sense of freedom was really worth the safety of the government fences. It wasn't long before the first sign of trouble appeared. Mason returned from a supply run one afternoon, his face grim. There was a group of infected, not close, but they were out there near the perimeter. Danielle's stomach dropped. "How many?" "5, maybe 6. Mason said, his hands flexing as if he were still holding his gun. "But they were organized, moving like they were watching us, waiting for something." Danielle's pulse quickened. "Waiting for what?" "I don't know," Mason replied. "But they didn't get close, stayed on the outskirts." That night, Margot called a meeting. The settlers gathered near the fire, and Margot's voice rang out over the crowd. "We've seen signs of movement," she said. "The infected are getting smarter, organizing. We've always had to stay alert, but it's getting worse. We can't ignore this." Connor spoke up, his voice gruff. "We've always kept watch. This place is as safe as we can make it. But we've got to start planning for more. We need to fortify." Danielle exchanged a glance with Mason. The tension in the air was palpable. The freedom they had hoped for now felt uncertain. They had chosen Riverton, but it was starting to feel like a fragile choice. Margot looked at them, her eyes scanning their faces. "We're not the only ones left. There are other settlements out there. Some might not be as well off as we are. We need to stay ahead of the infection, or we'll end up like the rest." The day began like any other. The sun hung low over Riverton, casting a warm glow across the settlement. People worked in their gardens, fixed homes, and tended to the few animals they had. It felt almost like life could go on, if only for a little while longer. But the peace was short-lived. started slowly, a distant shuffling like the wind rustling through trees. Then the ground trembled. The air shifted, heavy with anticipation. Danielle and Mason had just finished their morning chores when they heard it, the unmistakable sound of growing footsteps. "Do you hear that?" Danielle whispered. Mason's hand instinctively moved to his gun. "Yeah, something's wrong." Before they could react, the first scream echoed through the settlement. A woman's voice, sharp and panicked. Another scream followed, and the ground shook again with a thunderous roar, like a flood of bodies moving all at once. The infected, dozens of them, broke through Riverton's makeshift defenses, charging like a tidal wave. Mason grabbed Danielle's arm. "We need to move now." The infected flooded in, more than Danielle could count. They weren't mindless wanderers. They were frenzied, moving with eerie purpose, as if they had learned how to organize. The settlers screamed in panic as the infected tore through buildings, dragging people into the streets. The fire pit, once a place of community, was now a battlefield. The air was thick with smoke and gunfire. Mason pulled Danielle behind a crumbling wall as a group of infected charged past. "We need to get to the north edge," he said. "It's the fastest route out." They ran. Riverton's calm streets were now chaos, people barricading doors and windows, but it was futile. The infected smashed through everything in their path. Danielle couldn't look away. She saw Margot, their leader, firing at an infected in the infirmary. But there were too many. They reached the north edge, where a hastily constructed gate stood. But it wasn't enough. The infected were everywhere. As they neared the gate, Mason felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, gun raised, but it was Connor, his face pale, eyes wild with fear. "Go!" Connor shouted. "Get out while you can. We can't hold them off. This place is gone." "Connor!" Mason shouted, but Connor shook his head. "We can't hold the perimeter. Leave now. Take her to the safe zone." Before Mason could protest, Connor charged back into the chaos. "Come on!" Danielle grabbed Mason's arm, pulling him away. "We need to go." They didn't stop running. They pushed forward, feet pounding the ground, as they left Riverton behind. Burning buildings, smoke-filled skies, and the sounds of gunfire and screams echoed behind them. Danielle let herself feel the full weight of it. The world they had known was gone again. Riverton, the place they had hoped for, was now nothing but a memory. "We need to get to the government zone," Mason said, voice low but firm. "It's the only chance we have." Danielle nodded. The infected were getting smarter, but the government zone had to be their best shot. It had to be. They traveled for 2 more days, moving quickly under the cover of night. Supplies were running low, just scraps of food and water. But the government safe zone was their best chance, and it had to be enough. As they walked through a sparse dead forest, Danielle couldn't stop thinking about the people they'd left behind. Connor, Margot, the children. Once a dream of sanctuary, now a nightmare in ruins. Riverton was gone, and now they were alone. "I can't believe it's all gone. We thought we found something to build on, but we were wrong," Danielle whimpered. "Oh God, Mason, the children." Mason stopped and wrapped her in his arms. "We learned something, though. There is no real freedom without safety. Communities without walls are just buffets for the infected, waiting for them to decide it's dinner time. We are going to a government-controlled zone. If we come across another community, we can visit, but we aren't staying. On the third day, they reached the outskirts of the government safe zone. The first sign was the smell, disinfectant and sterilized air, a stark contrast to the world they left behind. Guards stood at the perimeter, rifles trained on the wilderness beyond. They didn't raise their weapons as Danielle and Mason approached. One of the guards, a woman with dark eyes, stepped forward. "Took your time getting here," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Mason stood tall, steadying his breath. "We're here now. We need shelter." The guard glanced at them, then nodded. "You're lucky you made it this far, but don't think it's all paradise inside. The government controls everything here. Do what they say, or you won't last long." She opened the gate just enough for them to slip through. The sound of it closing behind them was deafening, and in that moment Danielle realized something. They had survived, but survival was only the beginning. The gates of the safe zone closed behind them with a final thud, locking out the chaos, the danger, the uncertainty. The quiet that followed felt oppressive. Outside, it had been survival, unpredictable, raw, brutal. Inside, it was certainty, security. Mason and Danielle walked through the sterile streets, their footsteps echoing off the clean concrete. The perimeter was well guarded, but it felt nothing like the world they had left behind. The buildings were pristine, almost clinical, the air thick with disinfectant. There were no rations scattered, no makeshift shelters. Everything was controlled. The guards had shown them to a modest apartment after they were cleared by medical. Small, functional. It wasn't home yet, but it was a place to start over. The windows were sealed, the air filtered, and the lights never flickered. Outside, the world was crumbling, but here the system worked. At first, everything felt alien. Rigid routines, every aspect of their life governed by rules they hadn't yet learned to trust. Meals were rationed, jobs assigned, and freedom of movement restricted. The government controlled the supply of food, medicine, even social gatherings. But as the day passed, the weight of these regulations began to feel more like protection. Danielle worked in the medical wing, helping those who had survived the infection. Mason joined the security team, maintaining the perimeter, monitoring technology. At first, they were hesitant. Too many rules, too much control. But as time passed, Danielle found comfort in the predictability. The work was hard but fulfilling. There was structure in the chaos they had lived through for so long. Mason adapted in his own way. He had once questioned authority, but now, comforted by the routine, he slept easier knowing someone else was in control. After Riverton, he was ready for a more controlled environment. One evening, as they sat in their apartment, Danielle stared out of the window, her fingers tracing the cool glass. The outside world seemed so far away, like it belonged to another life. Mason sat beside her, a quiet presence. He had changed too, less restless, more at ease with the stability of their new life. "You know," Danielle said softly, I never thought I'd feel okay here. Safe, even. Mason glanced at her. Yeah, me neither. I thought the walls would be a prison, she continued. I thought the rules would suffocate me. But maybe it's not so bad. Maybe this is what we needed. Structure, security. We're not constantly fighting anymore. Some days, getting ready for bed, I realized that I didn't think of the infected once all day, or how much food we have stockpiled. I realized I spent a whole day just being alive. Mason nodded. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got. We've been fighting to survive for so long. Maybe it's time we just live. Danielle's fingers tightened on the window ledge. I think I'm ready to try living again, too, she whispered, her eyes distant. Mason turned to her, his voice quieter. We've had to focus on survival for so long. It's time to focus on each other and our life together. We need to look towards the future and decide what we want it to look like. Mason smiled, the weight lifting from his shoulders. Let's make it happen. The next few weeks passed quickly. Danielle and Mason were more than survivors now. They were part of a community, building a life they hadn't thought possible. The work was hard, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. They were starting to feel like they belonged, like this place could be home. They weren't waiting for the world to fall apart. They were building together. One evening, as they walked along the clean streets, Mason turned to Danielle. So have you thought about what you want our future to look like? He asked, his voice light. Danielle smiled, warmth flooding her chest. Yeah, sometimes. And what do you think? He pressed. She glanced up at him, her heart full. I think we can build a family here, a real one. Mason stopped, turning to face her. He took both her hands. Then let's do it together. Danielle's heart swelled as their eyes met. Together. And in that moment she knew the world wasn't done with them yet. They had survived, but now they were going to live. The sun rose over the safe zone, its light soft and steady. It was a new day, unfamiliar yet full of promise. Danielle sat by the window of their small apartment, her fingers tracing the smooth glass. Outside, life carried on. People worked in gardens, children played in the streets, and the distant hum of the perimeter security systems reminded them they were still in a world on the edge. But it didn't feel as heavy anymore. The weight of survival had lifted. There was peace and hope. Mason entered with a cup of coffee and a smile. It had become their morning routine, simple but grounding. They had found something here that felt like a foundation, a place to rest, rebuild, and dream. Good morning, Mason said, sitting beside her. Good morning, Danielle replied, turning to him. I was just thinking about what comes next. He raised an eyebrow, smiling. What do you mean? Danielle gazed out the window again. We've been here for a while now. Things are quieter than I expected. It's not perfect, but it's enough, more than enough. Mason's expression softened. He reached for her hand. I think about that too, every day, about what we can build here, not just for us, but for anyone else who might need a place like this. Danielle smiled, the weight of everything they'd survived and lost starting to make sense. They'd been given this chance. Together they could make it count. They could build something new, something that mattered. "I'm ready, Mason," she whispered, her heart full. "I'm ready to make a family, to start over." Mason squeezed her hand, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I am too. We'll make sure this place is worth coming to, a place where hope isn't just a memory, but a reality, a home for our family." They stood and walked toward the small balcony overlooking the town. The streets were filled with people, their lives moving forward in a way that felt peaceful, even for a world that had been torn apart. Danielle leaned against the railing, her heart swelling with peace. There was so much uncertainty in the world, but here in the safe zone, there was light, a real chance for something more. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the constant gnawing fear. She didn't feel like they were waiting for something to break. They were ready to live, to build, to find their place in this new world. And as Mason stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, Danielle knew they had found something worth protecting. Not just the life they had fought for, but the life they could create together. A few years passed steadily. The safe zone expanded, its numbers growing. Danielle and Mason became integral to the community's foundation. They worked hard to make this place more than just a safe haven. They made it a home. One day, Danielle walked through the streets, her hand resting lightly on her growing belly. She smiled at the children playing in the yard. The garden flourished, the homes were sturdy, and the walls, once a symbol of fear, now were a symbol of sanctuary. This was their new life. In the distance, across the clean horizon of the safe zone, the sun set on a world nearly lost, but now reborn. Together, they had made it through the darkness, and now they were building the light.